Bom dia. Como o Esper disse, acho que é a terceira ou quarta vez que faço a palestra de abertura nesse simpósio. E isso tem acontecido com uma certa frequência na minha vida agora, de me convidarem para palestras de abertura. Quando acontecer com vocês, não se iludam, é porque vocês estão ficando velhos, é só nessa situação que você é convidado para esse tipo de apresentação. Esta palestra que eu vou fazer agora, eu fiz na Universidade de Princeton umas semanas atrás. E o Esper achou que devia trazer esse tema para cá. Essa palestra foi feita num curso de antropologia da Universidade. E ela tinha o título de Health in the City. E o Esper achou que devia fazer a palestra aqui em inglês, o que para mim facilitou muito o trabalho, porque o texto já estava escrito e eu não precisei traduzir. Então eu peço desculpas por não usar o português aqui. Mas, basicamente, é uma visão que eu tive durante esses anos todos de atividade profissional da saúde na cidade em que eu nasci, que foi a cidade de São Paulo. I was born during the Second World War in São Paulo, Brazil, at that time a 2 million inhabitant city, which had become industrial since the beginning of the 20th century. We lived very close to downtown, in a grayish area, crowded with children, dogs, and collective houses, where the whistle of the factories marked the routine of the blue collars, of the women's errands at home, and of my little companions playing soccer the whole day on the sidewalk of the factory in front of our house. If I failed to be a famous soccer player, it was not by the lack of training. My neighborhood had such a large number of European immigrants that by the time I was 8, I could understand and even speak Italian and Spanish. One morning, when I was 7 years old, I woke up with swollen eyes. For the first time, my father took me to a pediatrician who diagnosed an acute glomerulonephritis. When we came back home, the game on the sidewalk was abruptly interrupted. All players came to me. They wanted to know if it was true that doctors use it to give huge injections in the buttocks of the children. Living at a walking distance from downtown, none of my soccer partners had ever seen a doctor in their lives. We can imagine what kind of medical services were offered to the 70% of Brazilians working in agriculture in the countryside. None of us received any immunization. Measles, varicella, mumps, whooping cough, and diphtheria were called children's disease, part of infancy's destiny as unavoidable as growing older. Any episode of fever that left the child feeble, somnolent, was enough to drive the mother mad, frightened by the omnipresent ghost of poliomyelitis, the scourge which crippled several of my school friends. The metallic sound of the orthopedic prosthesis, which accompanied the steps of girls and boys affected by the disease, was heard everywhere. In the beginning of the 50s, the birth rate in Brazil was more than 6 children per woman. Infant mortality was over 10%. Life expectancy barely reached 50 years. São Paulo insisted in its delusion of grandeur. In the next 20 years, the city received millions of internal migrants, particularly from the northeast of Brazil, who came in waves to escape from the periodic droughts and the miserable life they had in their devastated lands. The city was unprepared to receive so many people, who concentrated chaotically in the outskirts areas with precarious public services. By the end of the 60s, the population grew by 300,000 new inhabitants per year. I finished medical school. in 1967. My internship and residence were completed at the Hospital das Clínicas, which received patients from all over the country. Most of them had parasitic diseases, among them schistosomiasis, Chagas disease, malaria, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever. Intestinal worms were frequent in adults and almost universal in children. We had an entire ward just to treat undernourished infants. There was an infirmary of smallpox at Emilio Ribas. In the pediatric ER, the number of cases of diarrhea and dehydration was astonishing. In 12 hours of work, we usually had 3 or 4 deaths, sometimes 5 or 6. To lose a child was so common for a woman that it was not enough to ask how many children she had. It was necessary to ask how many survived. I remember me leaving the hospital by the end of the day depressed, outraged at the social order responsible for the silent suffering of those families. I decided to dedicate my professional life to the public health system, a dream that lasted only 2 years. Medical assistance was undermined by heavy paperwork and unmotivated doctors and nurses. Impossible to raise a family with the salary paid by the state. In 1972, I started working at the Cancer Hospital of São Paulo. Clinical oncology fascinated me. 42 years later, it is still my main activity with a busy clinical practice. At the time, Brazil had 90 million inhabitants, 6 million of them living in São Paulo. At the beginning of the 80s, I spent 3 months at the Department of Clinical Immunology of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. New York was the epicenter of the American AIDS epidemic. That stay changed my life. A disease that involved a probable virus, immunodeficiency, and cancer challenged my intellectual curiosity. I spent hours at the library of the hospital trying to read all articles published in medical journals. Coming back to Brazil, I was the only oncologist prepared to treat AIDS patients with cancer. Almost all the first cases of Kaposi's sarcoma were referred to me. Ignorance about the characteristics of the disease and routes of propagation had no limits. Lay press labeled it as the gay plague. Heterosexuals, especially women, considered themselves free of risk. Unprotected sex was a routine in Brazilians' lives, and there was a hidden epidemic of injectable cocaine in the underserved periphery of the city. In 1985, I received the invitation to be interviewed by one popular radio station of the city. It was the beginning of my long career as a mass media medical educator, which reached TV Globo, the main TV network of Brazil, on the Sunday night most popular and traditional show. 4 years later, to film a video about AIDS, I went to the detention house of São Paulo, popularly known as Carandiru, an overcrowded prison 15 minutes by subway from downtown, which with more than 7,000 inmates, at least 2 times the full capacity of the facilities. They were distributed in 7 pavilions. Cells had a variable number of men, 2, 5, 18, or even more. Space was a costly luxury. When I walked in and the heavy iron door slammed behind me, I felt the same tightening in the throat that I had as a boy watching those black and white American movies of jails and prisoners trying to escape from them. at matinee in the cinemas of my neighborhood. In the following weeks, I couldn't get the images of the prison out of my mind. Men leaning against the doors of their cells, the unshaven warden, a distracted military police officer on the rampart, holding a machine gun, echoes in the gloomy corridor. The smell Oi? Pulei o vidro. Não, vamos voltar. Desculpa, eu estou me atrapalhando bem aqui. Eu estava no... Depois eu dei play. Aí. Echoes in the gloomy corridor, the smell, the swagger of hardened criminals, tuberculosis, cachexia, and the silent figure of a dedicated doctor, my former student, who cared for the prisoners with AIDS. 2 weeks afterwards, I talked to the director of Carandiru, who would be killed by criminals 15 years later, and offered to implant a voluntary AIDS prevention program for the inmates. In those days, I had 20 years of clinical experience with critical and terminally ill cancer patients. Even though I was shocked by the suffering of the prisoners dying of AIDS in the infirmary, I spent the weeks introspective and uninterested in social events. My wife said she had never seen me so quiet. My introspection, however, didn't reflect the sadness that perhaps I should have felt as a doctor faced with that human misery. The perspective of delving deeply into the criminal world, although frightening, fascinated me so much that, to be honest, I was happy, excited about my work and in love with medicine, a profession as capricious as the loved woman, capable of provoking an unexpected crisis of passion through all the life. From May to August 1990, assisted by 6 skilled inmates, former addicts to injectable cocaine, I took blood samples from 1,492 men. The results showed that 17.3% were HIV positive, and 60% tested positive for the hepatitis C virus research conducted by Dr. Esper. In addition to these inmates, we studied 82 transvestites doing time at Carandiru. 78% were HIV positive. Of those who had been in the prison for more than 6 years, 100% tested positive. The infirmary was in fact a corridor with ordinary cells on both sides. Inside of each, a metal trundle bed with a foam mattress cut with a knife, a toilet, a sink, and nothing else. On the wall opposite to the heavy door, there was a barred window with broken pane. In the scant space between the bed and the wall, the patients would pile up a few items of clothes, a pair of trainers, flip-flops, plastic bags of food, bananas, stale bread, and coffee mugs. Some of them look healthy. They recovered from surgery after shootouts, knifings, burns from having boiling water poured over them by their enemies, crises of bronchitis and dermatitis. Others, thin from the tuberculosis that was epidemic in the prison, wandered about in Bermuda shorts and flip-flops, filling the corridor with coughing fits and cox bacillus. On the beds, rolled up in blankets, lay men with fevers, rigors, breathing difficulties, the insides of their mouths covered in thrush, bodies wasting away and wet with their own urine. They were in the terminal stages of AIDS. Their eyes had the resigned gaze that death imposes when it comes slowly. The reality proved to be more complex than I had anticipated. The number of patients who came from the pavilions steadily rose. There were crackheads with labored breathing, paraplegics with bed sores, victims of knifing aggressions, patients with epileptic fits, diabetes, hypertension, abscesses, and all sorts of dermatitis. It was like a crowd flocking to a miracle healer. I was not trained for that antiquated form of medicine without images or laboratorial confirmation. The doctor had to be quick, listen to the complaints, examine with the stethoscope, look them over generally, make the diagnosis, and prescribe medications in 5 minutes at most, accurately if possible. Carandiru had an enormous hall with no chairs on the second floor of Pavilion 6, where a cinema had operated before its destruction in a rebellion. Every Friday morning, we took 300 or 400 prisoners there, set up a screen with sound equipment, showed a video about AIDS, and answered questions from the audience. Moving so many men from their pavilion to the cinema and getting them back unscathed wasn't simple. The operation started at 8 a.m. when the cells whose occupants were going to hear the talk were unlocked before the others, and the inmates headed for Pavilion 6. Afterwards, at about 11, they walked back in an orderly fashion. The task of getting hundreds of prisoners out of bed before 8 o'clock, considered unrealistic by staff members, was circumvented by showing an erotic video at the end of the presentation after I left the hall. The strategy of combining music, preventive medicine, and sex was a box office success. It could work in other prisons. Week after week, for more than 10 years, hundreds of prisoners, often crossing paths with mortal enemies without a single incident. There was a pact of respect for the Friday cinema. The man sat on the door. On the screen, we showed a video of popular singers. At around 9 o'clock, we stopped the music, turned on the lights, and I would get up on the stage to say, "There is an AIDS epidemic in the house. Your mates grow thin and weak, go to the infirmary, and never come back." After that video, I will answer questions about the disease. Pay attention. There is nothing sadder than a man's life than in ending his days in jail. The questions they raised were concrete and respectful. They wanted to know what to do if they came into contact with the bodily secretions of someone with the virus, the risk of transmission to family members, the first symptoms, and the time the disease took to develop. They used expressions like penetration, anal sex, homosexuality, never slangs. After the last question, I would summarize 3 take-home messages. First, solidarity with a sick cellmate didn't present any risk. Second, without a condom, HIV could pass from man to woman, from woman to man, and from man to man, a practice in which the active partner was also at risk. Third, everyone who shot up cocaine was going to catch the virus. At the end, I would add in an evangelical tone of voice, if you can escape from the hell of cocaine addiction, use it in a suppository form. Swallow it, smoke it, but don't shoot it up for God's sake. Every time after that recommendation, the audience would break into a round of applause, which created a dramatic atmosphere for my exit from the hall. There was a hidden reason for that demonstration. Crack cocaine invaded the jail in 1992. Within a matter of months, cocaine injecting became unpopular and limited to a few die-hard slammers who later died of AIDS in the infirmary. Following the path of what happened in Carandiru, cocaine injections disappeared completely in the city. a phenomenon demonstrating that drug abuse is also a question of fashion. In January of 1994, we repeated the HIV prevalence study conducted 4 years earlier. Now, 13.7% of the inmates tested positive, against 17.3% in 1990. In 1998, the prevalence had fallen to 7.2%. Even crack has a good side. As part of the educative program, we published several numbers of a comic book, Street Dog, Vira-Lata, a character created by Paulo and Libero Malavoia. The hero was the son of a Brazilian mother with 5 fathers from 5 different races. He embodies the racial melting pot that is Brazil. His superpowers are a direct consequence of his hybrid origins, which gave him the agility to be at home in any social environment. The hero's past is cloudy. It's nebulous. All we really know about him is that he's a former prisoner, loyal to his friends, ruthless with the enemies, only has sex with a condom, and loathes syringes and needles. Street Dog was very popular among the inmates. The comic book helped us disseminate the information that cocaine injection was a very dangerous behavior, and to present condoms as part of the erotic repertoire. Carandiru became sadly famous when in October 1992, a rebellion erupted in Pavilion 9, brutally repressed by the police. At the end, 111 prisoners were killed. New images of the massacre were shown worldwide.
Last October, a riot broke out in Sao Paulo's House of Detention, the largest prison in Latin America. As the terrified relatives of inmates looked on, the city's notorious squad of police shock troops arrived. As they filed into the prison, those outside expected the worst. Their fears were soon realized. When it was over, 111 prisoners lay dead, shot in the back, torn apart by dogs, sprayed with machine gun fire. A massacre.
In 1999, I wrote Estação Carandiru, published by Companhia das Letras, a book which sold more than 500,000 copies, was translated to English as Lockdown, published by Simon & Schuster, filmed by the award-winning director Hector Babenco, viewed by more than 4 million spectators, and adapted for television. In October 2002, Carandiru was imploded. A park with a library and 2 schools were built in its location.
Varella, 15 anos de trabalho, hein? 7 segundos de duração.
Tivemos a implosão dos pavilhões pelo governador-geral.
I went to do the same work as a voluntary doctor in other prisons. The last 7 years I have spent in the feminine penitentiary of São Paulo, which imprisoned more than 3,000 women. In 1988, a new constitution was promulgated in Brazil. According to it, health is a right of the citizen and a duty of the state. No country with more than 100 million inhabitants dared to be so generous. The only problem is that they forgot to mention who would pay the bill. Now Brazil has 200 million inhabitants. Around 50 million have access to private medicine, and 150 million depend exclusively on the public health system. Distribution of resources is uneven. In spite of those difficulties, the public sector had some significant achievements. Our program of immunizations reaches virtually all children and is recognized by the World Health Organization as the most comprehensive of the world. The old spectrum of children's disease almost disappeared. We eradicated measles and polio. The Brazilian program of organ transplants offered by the Ministry of Health with no charge has the same recognition. The free distribution of antiretrovirals for HIV-infected people, which Brazil pioneered, changed the history of the epidemic in the country. In 1996, when the program was launched, we had the same prevalence of infection as in South Africa. Now, at least 10% of their adult population is infected, against 0.3% in Brazil. The success of Brazilian program changed the way the AIDS problem was dealt with in the world. Today, many countries receive international support for similar interventions in the 5 continents. Population growth in São Paulo was impressive. The greater São Paulo of today has more than 20 million inhabitants. It's the 8th most populated city in the world and the most important financial center in Latin America. It grew vertically. To see the moon, I have to risk my life at the window of my apartment. It's an ant-hill nest of hurried people. The unbearable traffic doesn't respect the time of the day, the flow or contraflow. Urban violence, contagious disease, became a universal phobia. We built more overcrowded jails. Ragged homeless and crack cocaine abusers wander in some downtown neighborhoods. Besides a fast-growing and affluent middle class and a bourgeoisie with plenty of privileges, the city is surrounded by poor houses with facades in bricks and rough graffiti, intertwined electrical wires, children playing in the streets, pregnant youngsters, crowded buses and trains, and groups of unoccupied teenagers on the corners. Single mothers are 3 times more frequent among the poor. Such an uneven distribution of income creates a schizophrenic reality to be faced by the health system. To deal with problems like infectious disease, teenage pregnancies, AIDS, maternal mortality, smoking-related diseases, drug addiction, homelessness, and at the same time to confront ailments characteristic of the developed countries, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, cancer, aging, and neurologic degeneration. 52% of the citizens are overweight or obese. If the prevalence of obesity insists to grow at the same rate of the last decade, we expect to reach the American numbers of today by 2020. I have no clean and well-organized cities inhabited by educated citizens at the seaside or in the middle of the mountains with unlimited horizons, silent streets at 8 p.m., bars and restaurants closed at 10. Charming places, magic landscapes, very pleasant for a weekend, but for neurotics like me, with the soul impregnated by the madness of São Paulo, to live in one of them would be to flirt with suicide. What challenges challenges and enchants me in São Paulo is what has to be done, the unexpected, the urban pandemonium which obliges me to reinvent the way of living 2 or 3 times per year. It's the human landscape, the mixtures of blacks, whites, Asians, ladies in sober clothes, boys with caps, couples French kissing, unaware of the passers-by, men wearing jackets and ties, charming women, homeless people on the sidewalks, transvestites, gay men hand in hand, alcoholics speaking alone, whores, guys delivering pizzas, and the legion of motorcycles rushing insanely between the cars. I will spend the rest of my days in that tormented city, ugly, unequal, aggressive, gigantic, absurd, with museums, bookstores, jails, bars, restaurants, symphonic orchestras, and more than 100 theatrical performances every weekend. And above all, to work and live in contact with the critical mass of disquiet and diversified people, which life history is different from mine, who will build São Paulo of the future. The city where we took the first steps will go along with us for the rest of our lives. We can move to other regions or distant countries to live for decades under the snow or the heavy sun, in the serenity of the province or the hostility of a metropolis. Makes no difference. The streets of our childhood shall be on every corner. Muito obrigado.